Deep Sea Embers Chapter 201 to 210. Chapter 201 Inches Penetration. Fire. Raging fire as far as the eye could see. The church grounds, the city, everything had been engulfed in a sea of red. Yet, Vanna stood stoically with her weapons in hand, a sword on the right and a machine gun she pillaged from a spiderwalker on the left. The hot wind blowing across the church grounds scorched the Inquisitor's nostril whenever she breathed. Nevertheless, her sharp senses were unhindered. She's scanning the premise for the heresy, for signs of the enemy to slay in this twisted history where planned had been destroyed. N-O-V-E in .c ohm. The fire that began in 1889, the flint that started it all and evaded the storm goddess's awareness, had finally shown its claws. Vanna never liked complex problems, but she had never been one to cower away from them either. Where are those heretics? A low, hoarse murmur suddenly came from the shadows of a nearby building. This murmur carried the power of blasphemy and malice, constantly warping the scorching air into a twisted picture of delusional illusion. But Vanna didn't look that way, only raising her barreled machine gun, turning it towards a seemingly empty spot, and pulling the trigger. The deafening roar of the bullets ripped through the air, and the yellow casings of the depleted bullets scattered out of the gun's cartridge with magnificent speed. Whatever was hiding in the gap between light and shadow was now forced to show itself by defending with that black umbrella and tentacles. Smirking at her own deed, Vanna launched the giant broadsword in her right hand out and nailed the monster to the ground several meters out. This wasn't enough though. Once she had succeeded, the Inquisitor promptly grabbed the deformed lamppost nearby and slammed the metal rod to the side. There's a second hidden attacker, and they just got smashed into mush by Vanna's monstrous strength. Its remnants were struggling and wriggling violently on the ground in an attempt to reform. But Vanna was having none of it. Turning her huge machine gun, the lady loaded a new ammo clip from her backpack and unleashed a barrage of bullets into that mess. Sneak attacks in groups of twos, that's the limit of your tactics. Vanna mumbled, casually tossing away the lamppost that had been severely distorted by her swing just now. Then raising her right hand, Vanna summoned her storm sword and continued with the execution. Yet, something was off after she got no response from the blob of blasphemy. No regeneration. She frowned and got closer to confirm the thing had indeed stopped squirming. It's even shriveling up like a prune before her eyes. What's going on? Why are these dregs losing their ability to regenerate? Is it because their main body is weakened? Or is it because these dregs have already been abandoned? Vanna watched this scene in confusion and vigilance, then jerked up and gazed ahead. Ads by PubFuture. Further away, a stream of green flame had appeared from within the darkness, quickly gathering and spreading throughout the square. The way it behaved was predatory, slurping up the corpse of these dregs. Burn, devour, grow, these were the first words that came to the lady's mind. She's wary of this new intrusion, but it didn't matter, for the green flames seemingly ignored her presence entirely. Before she knew it, the wave of the green had wandered past the square and out of sight. Torrential rain poured down on this day, washing away the sky and blanketing the city in a long conspired conspiracy. And when the power of the rainstorm could not stop Morris, the doom of fate came into play again. His car finally broke down. The old scholar decisively gave up the idea of restarting the car, knowing that the force of obstruction would only intensify. Moreover, the Ender had already announced his declaration, meaning the curse wouldn't allow him to fix this car. But the curse wasn't an unsolvable spell. Generally speaking, that thing could only guide or interfere with the event of reality to a varying degree. Morris popped open his car door and bit his lips as he braved the torrential rain that instantly drenched his entire body. Even standing there was staggeringly hard as the wind knocked him off balance. No matter though, Morris was a determined fella. Reaching up to keep his hat on, he clenched his coat and continued to trudge through this chaotic rainfall. He didn't have an umbrella, and there was little point in doing so in this weather when there's only half a block left. Before he knew it, Morris could even see the shop's sign through the raindrops with the faint outline showing through his vision. Finally, the curse placed on this scholar had lost its strength as the wind weakened around the streets. The raindrops no longer hurt when they hit Morris's face, and the biting cold didn't cause him to shiver. A few more steps, only a few more steps and you're there. Keep going. But just as he's about to make the final stretch after cheering himself onward, Morris suddenly heard another faint echo hitting his ear. Stop, you'll regret it. There is no salvation ahead, Plan will only be devoured by another catastrophe. History is about to complete its displacement. What you're saving is no longer the real reality, but a reverberation on the wrong path. Ads by PubFuture. Morris's footsteps did not stop though. Instead, he subconsciously quickened his pace until he's only several feet from the doorway. Here, the influence completely dissipated, evaporating into nothingness due to the power of the shop's owner. Morris found the weight lifting off his shoulder in that moment, causing him to lose balance and stumble through the door. Even in his partially dazed state, the old scholar could still hear the faint voices of two girls conversing upstairs. "Shirley, it's raining so hard." "Nina, yeah, it started all of a sudden. Good thing I listened to Uncle and came back early." "Oh, my hair is all wet. Shirley, can you help me dry my back?" Morris shook his head, letting his mind recover as the warmth cleared away the biting chill over his skin. Then, he noticed someone sitting behind the clerk desk, a blonde lady in a purple dress curiously gazing over. The old scholar's first impression was that she's very beautiful. However, Morris wasn't captivated by this feature, rather, it's the transcendent and elegant temperament of the other party. He's never met someone carrying such a mysterious and unique air around themselves, at least not anyone he's known within the upper class of Plant. For a momentary second, Morris found himself falling into a trance, hallucinating the lady sitting in a garden of flowers. He knew this was wrong, but he just couldn't help it. Suddenly, a weird thought had crept into the older man's head, that she might not be human. But this notion only lasted for a second before Morris dismissed it. This was Mr. Duncan's antique shop. If he has a new worker here, then it's not his place to pry into her identity. Then, he heard a greeting coming from the opposite side. "Old sir, it's raining a lot outside. Do you need help?" "Mr. Duncan, I'm looking for Mr. Duncan," Morris hurriedly answered after being startled. "It's very important that I speak to him." "Is he in the store?" "He is," the mysterious and elegant woman smiled. "He said he's suffering from a little high blood pressure, so he's currently resting on the second floor." Morris looked stunned. Blood pressure, a little high. The blonde woman behind the counter shook her head, looking all confused as well. "I don't know what's going on either." After we discussed the issue of history and fakes, his mood suddenly turned very poor. History and fakes. Morris's heart suddenly jumped, and as he's about to ask, Duncan's voice cut in from the stairs. "Alice, are there guests?" "Yes, Mr. Duncan." An unfamiliar old man. Morris looked up and saw Duncan standing on the stairs, half of his body illuminated by the light, half of his body hidden in the shadows. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Chapter 202 Inches Finding People. Duncan looked at old Mr. Morris in surprise due to how much of a mess the person was in. "Good day. What happened? You look like you ran all the way through the rain to get here." He slowly came down the stairs and greeted the old scholar. "Done, Mr. Duncan," Morris replied and took off his already soaked hat. "I need your help. I don't know how to explain this to you, and I don't know if you're willing to take action, but I found that Ender missionaries are operating in the city. They're tampering with the history of Plant, and I." The older man stopped after getting stuck on finding the next word. He seemed to realize how presumptuous his act of asking for help was and realized that asking for help from a subspatial being with an unclear position was in itself irrational. Would Mr. Duncan help with this? Why should he do this favor? Did the survival of humanity and the survival of the city-state matter to him? What threat do the Enders pose to him? Morris just stood there in a stunned state until Duncan broke the air with a nod. "I know." The chaotic starlight, the broken mirrors, the giant of light and shadow with mortal skin just answered his query like it was nothing. "You know." Morris was stunned but returned to his senses fast. "Ah, yes, of course, you wouldn't need me to tell you, I." Ads by PubFuture. The older man threw his hat to the side, raised his hand, and patted his head like someone that's committed an idiotic mistake. Muttering, "I've really grown senile to think you wouldn't detect the abnormality in the city. Then you must also know about Vanna." Duncan immediately frowned. "Vanna? The one who has a good relationship with Heidi? What happened to her?" "Vanna, she disappeared." Morris was shocked when he got such a reply and took a second to process it. Then adding quickly, "I'm saying Heidi forgot Vanna's existence, and no one else remembers her." Duncan became much more serious in his face. sit down and speak slowly. Alice, go prepare some hot tea for us. Pausing there, the shopkeeper turned to the blonde and asked something weird, do you remember how? Yes, Mr. Duncan, Alice chirped with a tone of glee. Morris watched from his spot as the elegant and mysterious blonde ran up to the second floor. In his view, Miss Alice's movements were bizarre. Not in a bad way of course, but rather it's too smooth and elegant, which was reminiscent of ancient nobles with excellent upbringings. Unfortunately, that's something difficult to find in this modern age. But his curiosity quickly gave way to the current state of affairs. After sitting at the front counter, he immediately told the shopkeeper in front of him about the abnormality he had noticed and the obstacles he encountered along the way. Duncan listened with a grim expression, only to speak after getting the full story. Ender missionaries, a bunch of troublesome guys indeed. Yes, this group of lunatics who exiled themselves out of reality since ancient times often makes a return through the cracks in time. They are committed to destroying the continuity of history and threatening the stability of the real world, but they rarely have the opportunity to make such a big ruckus like this, Morris said in a low voice. Under normal circumstances, the protection of the gods will block the penetration of the Enders before they step through, and the flame bearers are constantly working to strengthen the historical barrier. Those madmen must have sought outside forces to help them if they managed to break through the blockade. Your tea, old sir. Alice came over and placed the hot tea on the counter. Thank you. Morris hurriedly thanked her and reached over to receive the beverage. After being drenched by the storm, the old scholar needs something hot to warm his soul. However, the second he took a sip, he yelled and spat it back out. Conversely, Duncan remained indifferent to the outburst, tried to endure it. She's at least managed to find out where the tea is, although the amount she used is debatable. Morris turned his head in amazement at the mysterious lady, who was already wandering back over to the stairs daydreaming. Ads by PubFuture. What is the origin of this mysterious lady? Meanwhile, Duncan carefully took a tiny sip of his brew, confirming another detail he had just learned. The transcendent beings of this world have discovered the nonlinear nature of the Enders and the countermeasures needed to fight that group. But now, it seems that these countermeasures are not always effective. He closed his eyes slightly, allowing his perception to reach out and connect with the mark he left within Vanna's body. It's still flickering with life, a good sign. Morris looked curiously at the shopkeeper, who was behaving oddly. Mr. Duncan, you. Don't worry, Vanna is still alive. Duncan widened his eyes again and showed a calm expression. It's just that, she's currently existing outside of the normal plan. Can you confirm her location and status? Morris's eyes widened in amazement. He was actually mainly here to pass on the news of historical pollution, and the mention of Vanna's situation was only in passing. After all, from his point of view, Duncan and the city-state inquisitor should have nothing to do with each other. To think this great being already had his sights on Vanna. I'm paying attention to her. She's a good inquisitor. Duncan didn't explain anything and just nodded indifferently. Then without indication, he got up from behind the counter. What are you going to do? Morris promptly followed and got up as well. I'm going to bring Vanna back and take a look over there. Duncan strode towards the stairs and said without glancing back. But then he paused after remembering he still had a guest around. Do you want to go upstairs and take a hot shower? My clothes are longer than yours, but they should still do the job. Take a bath in this subspace lair and change into the clothes of the evil god. Morris almost fainted at the idea. Even the 4 great achievements of scholars wouldn't ever dare to imagine such a feat. With tingling skin, Morris quickly shook his head. No need, I'll just wait here. Then please take care of yourself. Duncan nodded and walked upstairs to find Nina and Shirley eavesdropping at the edge. Ads by PubFuture. The expression on Shirley's face was a little uneasy as she greeted Duncan. Mr. Duncan, did something happen? Why do you ask? Just now, we heard movement from the first floor. Shirley rubbed her hands, lowering her head as if she had done something wrong. Actually, it's Dog who heard it, saying that the Enders had appeared again and polluted history or something. Someone named Vanna is missing. Sounds like a very important person. Nina also looked over with an uneasy look. She was obviously more confused than Shirley. Uncle, what's wrong? NOVELBJN.C. Some small things. Duncan looked at the 2 girls who had vaguely sensed the turmoil approaching and felt nervous. After a little hesitation, He attempts to soothe their unease. You can rest in the house, and if you are bored, you can go to the first floor to chat with Mr. Morris. It's okay, don't worry. Shirley nodded, but Nina still looked worried as she grabbed Duncan's sleeve. Uncle, I feel a little scared. Is it really all right? And you, what are you going to do? Duncan stopped and quietly stared into Nina's eyes. Just like he had noticed before, Nina's senses were actually very sharp. She was not unaware of anything, she was just too sensible. But now the situation was slightly beyond the boundaries of her sensibleness. Nina, your uncle here is actually a very powerful person. Duncan suddenly laughed and reached out to press his hand on the top of the girl's head. But I can't explain it to you yet. You stay with Shirley for a while, and when it's over, I'll tell you what's going on. Just this level of reassurance still wasn't enough to calm Nina's unease. Nevertheless, as usual, the girl nodded obediently, just that her voice had grown softer. Okay. After Nina and Shirley went downstairs following his instructions, Duncan collected his emotions and hurried back to his room, to which he summoned I. The bird had been munching on fries back on the vanished. We've got to find someone, Duncan said with a serious look when he saw the pigeon appear. Serious and important business, double the ketchup when it's done. I suddenly jumped on the spot with delight. Loyalty is indescribable, loyalty is indescribable. Duncan exhaled slightly, letting his mind sink again to link up with the flickering mark he left on Vanna. What happened to the female inquisitor was an accident for him, but it also brought unexpected gains. Like the flames he released in Shirley's dream before. Although he didn't know how all this happened or why Vanna could get into contact with his ghost fire, one thing's certain though, Vanna had arrived on the other side of the curtain. And now, this powerful inquisitor, carrying Duncan's mark, has become a passage for Duncan to intervene in that curtain world. Spirit Walk, Chapter 203 inches both sides of the curtain. Torrential rain poured down, blanketing the entirety of Planned in an unprecedented heavy rainstorm. From an onlooker's standpoint, it's as if the endless abyss had overtaken the world, covering the sky with blackish ink and battering the city structures with its waves. It's a siege, a hidden invasion of the city. Even the dullest of folks would have noticed something was amiss under this strange atmosphere. Students rushed home, commoners closed their shops, the homeless rushed into the nearest shelter for relief, and the security forces activated all of the protective measures in place for any signs of attack. It's under this ominous atmosphere that Heidi barged into the square of the main cathedral with her car. Perhaps it's due to the goddess's protection, but the rain here was slightly weaker than elsewhere. This didn't relax Heidi though, on the contrary, this marginally lighter rain only worried the doctor more because it's proof that the rainstorm was caused by supernatural powers. The church guards promptly opened the main door after recognizing who it was, allowing Heidi to rush through the triple-spurred door of the cathedral. In light of the small trek, her body was already drenched in the cold rain. But she had no time to care about this little discomfort. Heidi had felt the restless atmosphere in the air around her the second she stepped into the cathedral, which was a warning of the soul, a reminder that an invisible conflict was gradually unfolding around these sacred grounds. No vel b in c om. A silent cleric received her at the entrance, and at her strongest request, the cleric promptly notified Bishop Valentine, who was praying in the church's main hall. Heidi waited for another 3 minutes in anxiety and restlessness before finally getting an audience with the respected bishop. To the doc's surprise, Valentine had come out in full ceremonial garb, a heavy 3-pronged crown on the head, a long holy staff in hand, and the storm codex hung around his waist. This was by no means the wardrobe of an ordinary day, but only in the most important ceremonies will the bishop be formally dressed in this fashion. These heavy and luxurious decorations are a huge burden, enough to make the able-bodied adult feel tired just by walking. Yet, Valentine remained steady and majestic in his steps, those eyes seeming to be brewing up a storm within those irises. "Child, what happened?" Valentine asks the psychiatrist with a serious expression. I need asylum of the highest rank," Heidi replied immediately, recalling her father's particularly stern order before leaving. "I want the entire Storm Cathedral to guard me, the child of Plan's most outstanding historian." Ads by PubFuture. The most outstanding historian of Plan, Bishop Valentine recited the sentence and met Heidi's eyes directly. There are literally bolts of lightning flashing within those eyes, a manifestation of the goddess's blessing on this high-ranking bishop. Then he closed his eyes slightly and nodded as if receiving guidance. "I have received your request, child. The cathedral will provide shelter, and you are safe. Thank you so much. Heidi took a deep breath, her gaze not once leaving Valentine's figure due to how solemn the air was. She didn't know what's happening, but in her view, the cathedral had clearly entered a state of imminent battle even before her arrival. Excuse me, what happened? It's war, Valentine said calmly. Someone has gone to war against planned. An unblessed storm has descended on our city-state. This is the signal for war, but it wasn't until your arrival that I finally learned who the opponent was. War. Heidi was stunned. Who is the enemy? Where are they? Valentine silently eyed Heidi for a long time before softly answering, it's planned, a plan that has been annihilated in history. With a thunderous explosion, the entire church seemed to be violently shaken by the rumble. Heidi was startled as she raised her head in horror, looking at the stained glass still clinking and clanking in the aftershocks of the bolt. Then, as she ogled at the dangerously swaying chandelier up at the center, she suddenly felt a huge tremor under her feet. It was the roar of a large number of spiderwalkers as they assembled in the square, followed closely by the roar of the steam tanks driven by the guardians from the armory. Heidi turned her head in shock and looked at Bishop Valentine, who remained quietly standing in front of the sacred statue like a reef in the sea. Then sputtering her words out of panic, is the enemy coming? The enemy has already arrived, Valentine said softly, his whisper still clearly in Heidi's ear amidst the constant noise of thunder. They arrived many years ago. Vanna slammed her sword down, blowing apart the rubble on the street and taking in the desolate scene ahead. Collapsed houses, roads covered in rubbles, and various piles of humanoid things slowly wriggling among the thick layers of embers. It's unbearable to watch this miserable sight, for she knew what they were, citizens of planned. They died in this history and were shaped into these abominations by the twisted powers of darkness. Ads by PubFuture. The young inquisitor pursed her chapped pale lips as emotions ran wild. However, the burning sensation from the lungs and the throbbing pain of the muscles told her this wasn't real, not yet anyways if she could do anything about it. Then something caught her attention as the lady stood at the intersection. A ghostly green flame could occasionally be seen between the wriggling ashes and the crackling embers, which was the imprint of some terrible ghost captain left in this false history. The ghost captain's position in this incident was strange and difficult to understand, and Vanna could not see the purpose of the other party at all, only that the mysterious power had mixed into the back of this curtain at some point. It's spreading around in this destroyed version of planned and opposing the distortion. Finally, after several minutes of jogging over the rubbles, Vanna had arrived at her goal, in this timeline, a chapel that remained intact during the fire. She had walked through a small chunk of the city to reach the 6th block. Well, strictly speaking, she had slaughtered her way across the city. Vanna took her sword and crossed the last of the obstacles, pushed open the charred metal gate, and entered the long prayer hall illuminated by the embers from the outside. Making her way through the place, the lady soon found the staircase leading down to the underground sanctuary where the dark wooden door stood. Vanna exhaled softly, relieving the pain and exhaustion in her various joints before taking the first step. She had already scrapped the machine gun she pulled off the spiderwalker, leaving her with only the trusted and reliable broadsword from the church. Once downstairs, the lady promptly tried pushing the dark door for resistance. Sure enough, it was locked with a latch. However, she also noticed something else from her attempt. Though faint, Vanna could hear the rhythmic breathing of the other sister inside. There's no need to hesitate anymore. With force, she blew apart the metal hinges holding up the blockade with a shove. You mustn't open the door. A shocked and nervous young voice, seemingly mixed with a third echo, sounded after the commotion. I'm your junior. Vanna strode in with the tip of her greatsword scraping the ground, causing a series of sparks to fly from the weight. Then, out of precaution, since it was too dark, the Inquisitor reached down to her waist and lifted the tenacious lantern up for help. Your battle sister. A nun armed with a long sword stood cautiously at the foot of the statue, watching warily at Vanna, who had just barged through the entrance. She was still young and wearing the old nun robe from 1885. Vanna looked at the wary nun on the opposite side and sighed softly. As she had suspected, it was only within this polluted curtain that she could step into the true enclosed underground sanctuary before the nun died in battle. This chapel in the 6th block was the first branching point. Sister. The nun holding the long sword adapted to the sudden light, seemingly unaware that the sanctuary's brightness had long been extinguished. In fact, if Vanna had taken a closer look, she would have seen the sister's shadow acting strange and different, predatory like it was ready to attack at any second. The main cathedral, hurry and leave, the corruption here is already out of control. While I can still. Vanna shook her head and slowly stepped forward. I'll help you. Chapter 204 Inches teleport out. I'll help you. Help me. The young nun frowned in confusion upon hearing Vanna's words. Gradually, her eyes fell on the other party's wardrobe and weapon. It was indeed the equipment and markings of the Storm Church, but it was not any of the formats she was familiar with, nor had she heard of a high-ranking female nun in the church who fought with such an exaggerated greatsword. The weapon was clearly specially made and by no means available to ordinary guardians. N.O.V.L.B. in .C. Ohm. The unusually tall, battle sister, in front of her, who looked as young as herself, came from an era she was not familiar with. After a moment of silence, the young nun suddenly asked, "Where are you from?" "The year 1900. I died today, right?" "Yes," Vanna calmly said, "it seems you already know what happened." "Ender missionaries, I don't know how they did it, but they chiseled a subspatial rift in the chapel here. I sent an alarm to the outside but received no response. A subspatial rift was chiseled in the place where the gods sheltered." Vanna's heart shook at the news. It's an unheard of situation that definitely left the Inquisitor puzzled at how it's achieved without alerting anyone beforehand. "Did I succeed today?" The young nun softly spoke again. "At least in this invasion, you blocked it." Vanna raised her head and peered into the nun's eyes. "You sealed their invasion in 1885 with your own death." "Oh, that's good," the nun sighed in relief and slowly raised her sword. At the same time, a low, crackling sound had come from the nearby darkness, which sounded like some slippery and sticky limb was crawling on the floor and coming out of a puddle of sticky liquid. Then the rest is simple. Adds by PubFuture. Vanna also raised the broadsword slightly. "This is my field of expertise." By the way, the nun suddenly turned her head again and asked, "Are they ready over on that side?" "We didn't receive your warning, so there were no extra preparations in place," Vanna said calmly, allowing her breathing to slowly adjust to her best form, "but the Guardians are always ready." A roar came from the depths of the darkness at the signal, and the creepy thing from subspace finally materialized its malicious projection in this closed-off space. The lantern on Vanna's waist was instantly stimulated, crackling and bursting like a firework. It's burning all of its holy fuel to fend off the corruption. At this rate, the light from the lamp would only last for a few minutes before it's completely depleted. In return, Vanna finally got her first look at the hideous abomination, which looked like an amorphous mess of sludge with the appearance of the young nun at its core. The hands and feet were deformed and grotesque, and the disgusting tentacles growing out of its back were evidence of its clumsy imitation of humanity. "Sister, I'll leave the rest to you," the young nun's voice sounded from the side when the wriggling monster was ready to pounce. At the same time she said this, the poor sister had pierced the silvery longsword into her chest, giving off an indescribable flash of baptizing light. Agonizing screeches roared out of the monster's mouth in the second the nun's heart stopped. It wriggled and rolled around ferociously, struggling to cling to life until it went limp in the next. The battle was over. Vanna flinched to the side and hadn't the heart to watch, only muttering a solemn and devoted phrase for her fellow battle sister, "Please bear witness, your sacrifice won't be forgotten." What appeared in the underground sanctuary was only a projection of the invasion against reality. Still, for this low-level nun who became a host of subspace, her life had already been lost when it merged with the monster. So long as she lives, so does the monster. And now, it's finally ended. Unfortunately, to Vanna's shock and horror, the nun's body didn't remain in place as she expected. Everything had reverted back to its original state before her interference. The scars of battles on the walls, the bloodstains, and the shadow lurking in the darkness. The cycle of abomination continued. "How?" Vanna stood there in stunned disbelief, her face distraught at the futility, "but this is just a polluted." Her words did get to finish though. From the corner of her eyes, a flash of green flame had flickered into life, quickly growing and expanding into a huge cyclone to form a doorway. From it, a tall and majestic figure emerged, stepping through the barrier and into this world. "Because the pollution is too deep, and the culprits have detected your awareness by now. Vanna, what you need to correct isn't just this chapel and the nun, but the entire city-state." Adds by PubFuture. Captain Duncan. Vanna's eyes widened instantly. She knew that the power of this ghost captain had invaded this side, when she saw those green flames spreading around like a plague, but she didn't expect that the other party would appear directly in this place and at this timing. Subconsciously, the lady clenched the broadsword in her hand and almost reflexively jumped for a hit. Thankfully, logic won out in this bout and subdued the impulse. "What do you want?" "Take you back to the real world." Duncan looked at the other party indifferently. "I thought you would behave like the last time and make a somersault slash on my head. I know this attack is useless to you, and what's here is not your main body anyways." Vanna's muscles adjusted themselves for combat again. "You said you want to take me back to the real world. What do you mean by that? Is it so hard to understand? Don't you need help now?" Duncan raised an eyebrow. "Or do you have a way to get out of this world by yourself? Like running across the entire city?" The corner of Vanna's eyes twitched unconsciously due to the mockery. She had to admit that going around the entire city was her initial plan, but she won't say it aloud. "This dangerous natural disaster of the sea, what does he want with me?" Duncan didn't bother to explain further at this point. Raising his right hand, he summoned up a flickering green flame at his fingertip. Vanna was taken aback and promptly took a defensive posture. "What are you doing?" "Send you back to the real world. What else?" Duncan said casually. "But I haven't done this before either, so let's give it a try. If it works, then great. If it doesn't, then we will need to come up with something else." "Try." Vanna gawked at the famous ghost captain with a stunned face. For some reason, she always felt that the other party's actions were extremely inconsistent with the records in the archives. "Stop, otherwise I will." "Vanna, your fight lies in the real world where the battle has already begun. A storm is ravaging the city. Don't waste your time here where the enemy is already aware of your vigilance." Duncan interrupted the young inquisitor to avoid wasting time. "The battlefield outside needs you more than you acting alone here. Touch this flame, or I will do it for you." Vanna stared at the flame in Duncan's hand, not moving a single step as the bells of danger rang through her head. To be fair, even if she didn't know who Duncan was, normal people would definitely not touch something so creepy. Of course, Duncan himself knew this, so the asking was only politeness on his part. Taking advantage of the lady's contemplation, he suddenly shot the flame out and wrapped the inquisitor within a firewall. Then in a swoop, Vanna was gone, following a roar from her mouth. Harriet. On the streets of Planned, where rain poured down like a waterfall, a tall female figure suddenly emerged out of thin air and swung down with a giant broadsword. The poor garbage can in place was split in two by Vanna's chop, leaving a deep gash on the ground as a result. Caught off guard by the abrupt teleportation, Vanna had to take a second to organize her brain at what had happened. Then with a blank stare, she looked around her surroundings in amazement after realizing she's back. Chapter 205 Inches Acceleration. Morris sat on the first floor of the antique shop, waiting for time to pass with great nervous tension. It was still pouring rain outside, and the cold wind had grown uncomfortably unsettling as it whistled against the outer walls of the store's structure. Nina and Shirley were the most affected after they came downstairs following Duncan's advice. Like the old scholar, both girls kept peering out the glass window due to how thickly dark things had become on the streets. They could hardly make out the shape of the closest building, let alone see who's still walking on the street or not. The scenery in the city is fascinating. Alice suddenly joins in on the group, abruptly interrupting the uncomfortable atmosphere and bringing new air to the mix. "But I see you're all very nervous. Is something scaring you all?" "Miss Alice, aren't you afraid?" Nina swung around and asked in astonishment at how chirpy the lady was. "No, I think it's quite fun actually." Alice smiled and shook her head reservedly, "and Mr. Duncan will solve the problems if there's any." "Does that mean you know what's happening?" Nina bit her lip and asked boldly. She still had reservations about her uncle knowing a lady as beautiful as Alice without her own knowledge. "You sound like you trust my uncle a lot." "I trust him, Alice said. "Of course. I don't know what's happening, but Mr. Duncan will solve it anyway." Her overly calm and straightforward attitude had left Nina speechless. For a while, only silence hung in the air until a loud bang of thunder shook the window. This startled the occupants. The most notable was Shirley and Nina, who had covered their ears and shrunk their necks back out of reflex. "Vanna is back." Morris peered out the window and muttered this before raising his voice at the realization, "Vanna is back." Ads by PubFuture. "You mean the Inquisitor?" Shirley heard Morris shout and turned her head in surprise. "What's wrong with the Inquisitor? What do you mean by she's back?" Morris didn't respond to Shirley's question because he didn't know where to begin. Instead, he sighed long and hard before crashing down on the nearest seat. It's been a dreadful day, but after having his chaotic and divided memories merge, he knows the long-awaited ray of sunshine was about to break through on this dark, gloomy day. The green firewall faded, and the dim underground sanctuary returned to its previous appearance, leaving only the last cluster of flame to float quietly beside Duncan as his light. Vanna has left this side, and returned to the other side of the curtain. He could tell by the striking outline of the beacon he left on the Inquisitor. I got to say, that jump strike sure is scary, he muttered softly. Then turning around, the man marched over to the closed door of the underground sanctuary. History has been solidified here, and Vanna's intervention didn't stop the cycle from continuing. The lady's indeed powerful, but her expertise lies with defeating heretics, not mending the distortion in time-space. Duncan stood quietly beside the deceased nun, then slowly stretched out his hand to only stop as the nun's body suddenly moved. The poor girl had looked up with those dying eyes and asked in confusion. "Oh, as I had suspected before, you weren't dead yet," while holding up the door. Duncan met the nun's gaze and calmly said, "Is there anything you want to say?" "I had a brief dream. I dreamt of a battle sister appearing here. She tried to help and lay me to rest from this cycle. But she failed," the nun said weakly. "She was really here, wasn't she? She's done her best, but it's not her area of expertise. Now, she's back where she belongs." Duncan bent down and lightly placed his hand on the nun's longsword, allowing his ghost fire to swim along the surface and encompass both the weapon and owner. "I'll take over from here." Ads by PubFuture. Are you also a guardian of the city? The nun seemed to have no strength left to fully open her eyes as she murmured, "I haven't seen you." "I'm not." Duncan shook his head slightly, "but for the time being, I can be." The nun seemed to have stopped listening to him as the last ember of life left her for good. "She's fallen into a dream, the dream of the afterlife. Please bear witness, these are the last words of this devoted follower of the storm." I witnessed it. The green flames soared into the air, sweeping everything up within this underground sanctuary in a blazing hurricane of power from the man's will. Whatever curse and manifestation of subspace will be destroyed at this point, and any soul trapped in this room will be freed. All shall succumb to the ghost captain's will. Duncan waited for the last remnant of corruption to be destroyed here before finally stepping up to the main floor of the chapel. For the first time since 1885, the door was opened from inside the underground church. Here, in the prayer hall, there's no longer the devout phantom of a praying nun, no lit candles, and no neatly arranged benches for worshippers, only broken glass windows and a collapsed main hall littered with rubbles. Duncan had dispelled the curse and turned this domain into his territory, his property. But he didn't need it. Once he was out of the premise, the ghost captain turned around and watched as everything burned for good, wrapped in a devouring pyre that would finally put everything to rest in this small property. He's done here and could do no more for the lone defender. Then with narrowed eyes, he allowed his senses to spread, connecting with every flame cluster across the city. They also sensed Duncan's arrival and activated, growing and becoming torches instead of mere small flames in this curtained world. Ads by PubFuture. Simultaneously, Duncan also felt something awakening in the depths of this twisted reality. It's a roar, an outrage of anger that burst forward in the form of ash and red fire. It's imposing to look at with his mind. Nevertheless, the ghost captain wasn't afraid, only amused at the belated reaction to his arrival. A bit late to be taking action now, don't you think? On the vanished, Duncan had pushed open the door of the captain's bedroom and strode over to the mapping table. With a low and imposing voice, he stared down at the blinking dot. "How far are we from planned?" "Oh, Captain, there are less than 2 days left before our arrival," came the goathead's reply at once. "Theoretically, we may now run into merchant ships or patrol vessels of the various islands in the vicinity." Duncan did not interrupt the report, only silently calculating something within his mind at what's plausible. Then with a huff, he straightened himself and marched out of the captain's room. "Ah, what are you going to do, Captain?" Goathead's echoing voice could be heard crying out from the rear before the door slammed shut. Duncan had already marched out of the captain's room, crossed the aft deck, walked up the stairs, and came to the steering wheel before replying with his mental connection, "I will be personally driving the ship." "Yes, Captain." After hearing the loud response, Duncan grabbed the steering wheel and felt a surge of power riding over him. The Vanished was overjoyed at his touch and a signal that something had activated with the ship's structure. Everything was coming alive, much more so than usual. Sure enough, the sails instantly formed a translucent film, the cables shook in the air with life, and the hull constantly creaked against the battering waves with energy. There's power manifesting around the body, propelling and breaking the tide like magic. They're picking up speed at an incredible rate. Feeling the distance between himself and the body in the antique store getting closer, Duncan softly exhaled, "No-vel-b in .c ohm." Suddenly, an inexplicable feeling emerged from the bottom of his heart. It's a subtle perception that he's being targeted from afar. How should he describe it? Imagine a sonar radar. In the split second when he grabbed the steering wheel, his position was given away to the opponent due to some connection they shared. Duncan frowned and looked toward where that subtle discomfort was coming from. Almost simultaneously, Goathead's urgent ringing had come into his head. "Captain, the sea mist has appeared nearby." Chapter 206 Inches Encounter. A steel warship with a towering bow was sailing across the vast open sea. There's constant fog lingering around the metal monster, just like the cursed frost of the frozen north. On the deck of this steel battleship, 6 triple-barreled giant artillery guns acted as its main arsenal, with secondary turrets of smaller sizes acting as support. In this state of readiness, no mortal vessel would dare challenge this behemoth because it's not only operated by the undead, but its captain was also an infamous pirate known worldwide. But don't assume they're just rabbles that only know how to pillage and rob. The battleship was a tight vessel, and everything ran with swift precision below deck. No-vel-b in .c ohm. And that's not all. In the tail end of the sea mist, a tiny church with its own independent broiler had also been performing a prayer. The gloomy undead priest overseeing the ritual had lit the incense candle used to repel evil, allowing the blessings of the goddess to course through the steam pipes that stretched across the entire vessel. Like the rest of the undead crew, the priest was also an old watery corpse with half of his skull smashed in on one side. However, one unique feature that differentiates him from the rest: those white eyeballs were mucked by 2 dark clouds, reflecting the faith of Gomona that's still watching over him. This was how a fully functioning ship worked in this modern age, utilizing a miniature church that endowed the vessel with the goddess's blessing through the steam pipes created a vein-like structure that shields the ship from corruption. Truly a technological marvel that's been tested in 1835 when a major event nearly destroyed an entire fleet if not for this structural design. And from a certain point of view, the era of naval technological innovation could also be traced back to the 1800s, when the Vanished incident occurred. The most advanced exploration ship in human history directly plowed into subspace by losing its way, a piece of news big enough to warrant anyone's attention. The undead priest finally withdrew his gaze from the goddess's statue after making the blessing. After half a century of not having beating heart, his numb and cold body was surprisingly restless at the thought of encountering the Vanished. "May you shelter us from the darkness," the priest bowed his head and prayed reverently for a second time. "We will confront the shadows of subspace head-on. Please bear witness." The electric bell on the side suddenly rang the second the prayer ended, and a small light flashed in front of the communication desk. The priest came to the communication desk and turned on the copper tube corresponding to the small light. "This is the church, yes, the grease and steam are ready, and the blessings have come." On the bridge, the captain of the Sea Mist, Tyrion Abnomar, stood quietly in the captain's spot, overseeing the seemingly calm sea in the distance. His eyes were aching with pain as a disturbing murmur echoed in his head. Tyrion knew why he's suffering from this. Sitting beside his right hand was an intricate brass machine comprising many intermeshing gears, compass dials, and a small bowl at the center with the man's blood. First Mate Aiden came over from the side then, nodded to Tyrion, and reported, "Captain, the units are ready, and the church has reported in the goddess's blessing is activated." "The Vanished is just ahead," Tyrion whispered as if to himself and then glanced back at the brass machinery next to him. "I think he must have sensed me too." First Mate Aiden's gaze also fell on the brass machine, especially the boiling blood. The pale-skinned bald man spoke with a low voice. "The blood compass will guide the reunion of those connected by blood, but this item never brings good luck in reunion, it points only to slaughter and desolation." Fitting in this situation, Tyrion said lightly. At the end of his field of vision, an ethereal black spot seemed to have loomed into view. It really came, pointing straight at plant. "We can fire," the first mate couldn't help but remind. "Actually, we could have done so just now." "No," Keep getting closer until we're in close range, Tyrion shook his head. We already tried it once half a century ago. The shelling from long distances will never fall on the Vanished. That ship is affected by some kind of distorted space-time, and anything outside of it will get warped by the distortion. Aiden lowered his head. Yes, the sea mist will continue to move forward. Duncan put down the binoculars in his hand, rehung them around his waist, and then continued to hold the steering wheel tightly. He saw the ship as well. As its name suggests, the sea mist was surrounded by a thin layer of ice fog, which does not look like a normal phenomenon. But what really surprised him though was not the layer of fog that seemed to be related to supernatural powers but the state of the ship itself. It was a very advanced-looking steel battleship with heavy armor, towering chimneys, a well-structured and stylish bridge, and an advanced multi-mounted battery reminiscent of modern-day naval warships. None of the sea mist resembled anything like the wooden galleon of the Vanished. In fact, he couldn't even see a sailing mast on it, let alone a wooden hull. This made him recall some rumors about the sea mist and Bright Star. For example, Tyrion's warship was a monster that grew and transformed by devouring metal alloys. As to where it gets the metal, that's simple, the ships it vanquished and the alloys found on the seabed. Now it seems that these rumors were born with a reason. Duncan shook his head, temporarily putting aside the thoughts that were out of tune with the situation. Ads by PubFuture. The sea mist had no intention of backing down and seemed ready for battle. Unfortunately, he didn't have time to make a detour either, meaning a confrontation was inevitable. Duncan didn't know much about naval warfare, but in theory, he didn't have to worry about combat. The cannons on the Vanished could handle everything independently. Even so, it doesn't mean he could remain calm like an experienced pirate. He's still, what's the word? Excited, nervous. Tyrion Abnomar, captain of the Sea Mist, is one of Captain Duncan's children. Theoretically, Duncan's current identity meant he's the father of the pirate leader, and no father would want to confront their children in this manner. Isn't that ship supposed to stay in the cold sea? Shouldn't you be busy looting homes and collecting protection fees? What's the deal in coming here? Tyrion looking for daddy, father and son reunion. Captain, came the voice of Goathead suddenly, sounding a little excited. The sea mist has begun to enter its firing stance. Shall we adjust our positioning? Adjust the orientation, avoid the first direct fire coverage of the opposing weapon, and enter the combat position with the least hull projection while bringing as many of their own weapons into firing angle. Goathead was clearly ready for an artillery battle. Duncan raised his eyebrows. You sound like you're looking forward to it. The sea mist is a good opponent. First of all, it can't beat us. Secondly, it dares to fight us. The wooden sculpture sounded pleased. Finally, the sea mist is very durable regarding a beatdown. That ship is full of the living dead. Even if the ship itself is tainted with a little, unsinkable, characteristic, it's still a far cry from the dominance of the Vanished. There's no better practice board for us. In short, you want to give the kid a beating lesson, right? Duncan said blandly. Exactly then, the ghost captain had caught sight of the fog dispersing apart from the sea mist. Then shortly after that, a sharp whistling sound sounded from the metal beast, followed by the chugging of the mechanical engine of the sea mist running at full throttle. It's declaring war. As expected, the sea mist fired first. As a steel ship that's technologically more advanced than the Vanished, its weapons range could walk circles around the old wooden galleon under Duncan's control. This preemptive strike instantly sent the ghost captain into a nervous wreck inside, which any normal person should be in. Numerous water columns rose up from the sea over the bombardment, shaking even the hull of the Vanished from the recoil. Yet, none of them fell on the Vanished itself. The sea mist's first round of shots had all been missed. Now, this left Duncan wondering if this was how ancient naval battles ensued. Since there are no guided missile weapons in this world nor highly complex computers to help handle the angles, it would be safe to assume the hit rate to be only at this extent. Chapter 207, The Encounter has begun. The encounter began with the first round of shelling being thrown by the sea mist, which roared over the sea like a thunderclap as the shells whizzed across the air, only to miss and stir up columns of water in the chaotic volley. November LBJNN. Like the first, the second round all missed as well, and it wasn't until the third round of shelling that the sea mist finally swiped at the Vanished side. As the monstrous ghost flames burned blazingly between the seams and mast of the Vanished, Duncan tightly gripped the steering wheel as the ghost ship slid across the sea like a flaming mountain. Nothing could hinder his vessel, not the waves and most certainly not the columns of water that blew up from the cannonballs. But then, the corner of his eyes caught sight of a black shadow swiftly blasting over at the rear deck. It was an iron shell from the sea mist. After multiple misses in a row, the steel battleship finally calibrated its guns, and a cannonball whizzed impartially toward the second half of the Vanished. This time, it's truly unavoidable since slamming the rudder wheel to avoid enemy fire doesn't exist in reality. Even the Vanished must follow the most basic of physical laws when sailing in the real world, probably. The ship was about to be hit. But the next moment, Duncan suddenly felt his vision growing extremely sharp. He could even capture the complete trajectory of the shell when it fell slightly off base, see the twisted heat wave around the cannonball, know the airflow pushed back by the shock wave, and see the red-hot grooves of the iron ball. The cannonball was answering his stare. At the last second of hitting the Vanished, the surface of the shell from the sea mist suddenly rose up with a faint green flame, as if it was instantly infected and assimilated by the ghost fire around the Vanished. Then, it quietly turned into a green meteor and gently fell into the sea of fire encompassing the Vanished in a slow and strange arc. The shell landed on the deck of the Vanished and caused the ship to shake, but that's all. The Vanished didn't sustain any damage. A beautiful catch. The voice of Goathead suddenly sounded from his mind, making Duncan come back to his senses. Captain, how did you do it? Subconsciously, I didn't think much about it, Duncan replied casually. Immediately afterward, more howling whizzes zoomed across the sky and came straight in for a second round. He instantly tensed his nerves and controlled the massive hull of the Vanished to slightly adjust its course to avoid the incoming black objects. In the next second, one green meteor after another appeared overhead over the ship. But Duncan's capture was not without limits. As the distance between the Vanished and the sea mist closed, the latter's shelling became more accurate and ferocious. Worst of all, the many secondary artilleries the foe carried finally reached the effective range as well and began barraging the Vanished. This finally caused Duncan to lose sight, allowing several shots to pass his defenses. Adds by PubFuture. The first part of taking damage was the side of the front hull, pierced by a black ball through the plank and tearing a hole that splintered off shrapnel into the air. However, the pieces didn't fall into the ocean as expected. Instead, they were suspended in the air, synchronizing with the Vanished's speed as it continued to move. This was an extremely bizarre scene, as if the hull structures shattered in reality are still one with the Vanished in some higher dimension. This instantly reminded Duncan of the bottom of the ship and the broken but still fully functional bulkhead soaked in subspace. In the next second, he saw the debris slowly returning to its original state like a clock had rewinded itself. Duncan finally retracted his gaze from the side of the ship. It was the first time he'd seen the Vanished damaged and the first time he'd seen the ship recover after being injured. The ship could heal itself so quickly. And that healing process looks like it had directly returned to the state of prior damage. He finally understood why an extremely advanced, heavily armed steel warship like the Sea Mist could not defeat a century-old ghost ship. Subspace has completely transformed the Vanished, leaving the entire ship in a weird structural state. It simply cannot be defeated by ordinary firepower in the real dimension. Captain, the Vanished is the best ship in the world, right? Goathead's voice sounded in his head again, this time with a sense of pride. It's as you say, indeed. So what's next course of action? Duncan raised his head slightly and stared at the Sea Mist. Give the kid a beating lesson, of course. Adds by PubFuture. Captain, that ship sped up. First Mate Aiden's voice sounded on the bridge nervously. Something is not right. Our attack is much less effective than the hasty confrontation half a century ago. More than half of the artillery shells have inexplicably disappeared into the fire of the Vanished. I can see that. Tyrion stood upright on the bridge, staring fixedly at the ghost ship accelerating towards this side and beginning to adjust its course slightly. He's become even stronger than the last encounter we had. With a gloomy face, his hands unconsciously gripped the guardrail. So are we still fighting? The first mate asked loudly. From the way things look, it may not be easy to expel the ghost ship back to subspace like before. And I think your father must be very angry right now. The speed of that ship now is simply 4x fast. Tyrion went darkly quiet for the next few seconds before speaking in a deep, low voice. Keep fighting. As he uttered these words, his eyes were still fixated on the upper deck of the giant burning ship. He knew that's where the helm wheel was located and that his father would always stand there in those distant and yellowed memories. Is he still there? Was he looking at the sea mist? Large clouds of smoke rose from the sea then, followed by a faint roar in the ear. "The Vanished has fired," some undead sailors exclaimed. Tyrion still stood firmly in the captain's spot like an iceberg standing in the cold sea, but then he frowned. The Vanished did not fully adjust to the appropriate angle before shooting its weapons. Instead, it cut into a slightly inclined arc and shelled along the way toward the sea mist. This meant that only about a quarter of the ship's side guns would be functional. Ads by PubFuture. Is it just symbolically fighting back? He has no intention to fight with the sea mist to the end. This is not my father's style, nor is it consistent with the experience of the encounter half a century ago. In that battle, the Vanished and the sea mist fought to the bitter end until both ships were so badly damaged that any ordinary vessel would have sunk. Indeed, the Vanished reached the limit of its repair ability and had to temporarily retreat to subspace after that battle, while the sea mist had to be towed back by its escorts for a 3-year-long repair. But the current situation does not allow Tyrion to continue thinking. The Vanished's return fire has arrived, and every shelling shot from the ghost ship after it came into effective range was chillingly accurate. More than a dozen blazing green fireballs streaked over the sea and smashed onto the steel battleship's hull. In an instant, explosive roars and ghost fire rose from the impact one after the other. Layers of light floated around the sea mist, and the ship's church and various holy relics spontaneously activated to resist the spread of pollution caused by the flame. Unfortunately, a large number of terrifying holes still appeared on the hull of the steel battleship in an instant. The burning cast iron cannonballs were like fire hitting the snow. Everything it touched, whether steel or wood, melted away and was swallowed away in a flash. Under such circumstances, no amount of armor would matter when the enemy's attack completely disregards the principles of matter. The flames didn't care about the protective barrier, nor did they care about material substance. All it cared about was what it could devour and erase. Before long, large chunks of the sea mist were gone instead of merely taking a few hits. If not for the unsinkable characteristic of the undead ship, it would have also long sunk by now. However, unsinkable doesn't mean unstoppable. The sea mist had lost its power to fight back and continue moving forward. Tyrion's eyes widened. Wrong, it's different. It's completely different from the last time. He didn't know this ship. This wasn't the ship he remembered. And in the midst of his dismay, he noticed that the Vanished had suddenly stopped shelling. The ghost ship inflated all its sails, engulfing the huge waves of the entire sea, and sped up to the limit as it rushed past the sea mist. Full turn on the left rudder. Move, move. First Mate Aiden suddenly roared, sending the already frantic helmsman to turn the wheel with all his undeadly might. Sadly, the efforts failed because they were now on a collision course with the ghost ship. "The rudder has failed," the helmsman shouted in horror. "It's turning on its own. We are taking the initiative to meet the other ship." As the helmsman said, the sea mist was actively meeting the ghost ship. Tyrion had already sensed the movement. First, he had heard the abnormal hissing from the machine under his feet, ratting and rumbling with a hair-raising tune. Then came the standing down of the guns and cannons on his own ship, which had obviously never occurred half a century ago. The worst possible nightmare had become true. The sea mist recognized its flagship. Chapter 208 Inches of verbal exchange after 100 years. On the vast and boundless sea, two powerful warships carrying curses were currently on a collision course for each other, magnifying and expanding their respective field of influence as the distance closed. The sea mist had its chilling effect, creating large and small ice floats around the water that spanned several nautical miles. Even the original calm sea had started to churn into a whirlpool, wrapping and competing with the Vanished's volcanic explosive green flames. It's a magnificent display of ice and fire, assuming one ignores both vessels' ghostly and corruptive nature. Unfortunately, the sea mist only looked strong from the surface at this point. Its engines were grinding with dying roars, and of course, the church's blessing still worked. Under this helpless state, the undead sailors watched as the battleship under their feet rushed towards the burning ghost ship, towards the bowels of the most terrifying existence in the open sea. For Tyrion, though, this wasn't some entry into the devil's mouth but the long-awaited reunion with his father, whom he could vaguely see by now on the towering stern of the Vanished. He recognized the towering man standing on the ship like a reef in a storm, steering the creaking wheel with both hands and making an indifferent yet commanding face like all those years ago. Then, without accident, the two ships collided. The expected devastating impact and disintegration did not come, Instead, the crew of the Sea Mist was fortunate enough to experience the same terrifying and strange spectacle as the original White Oak. The burning ghost ship rolled over like a colossal mountain. The boundaries of all things became blurred within the flame, turning the Sea Mist and its crew into ethereal ghosts themselves. This scene appeared to the outsider as if a phantom had crashed into another phantom. First mate Aiden's eyes widened in horror. First, he saw the bow and mast of the Vanished rushing towards him, and then he staggered and directly went through the wooden planks before entering one of the cabins on the other ship. After a brief stint of meeting the quaint pillars inside the vessel, and the burning green lanterns, he was back outside, where he's confronted by the open deck of the flaming ghost ship. Tyrion subconsciously took half a step back as well over the spectacle, but in the next second, he straightened his chest again as if a certain teaching of his father was still in his ears. Don't back down or bow to the wind and waves. So he held his head high and confronted the wind and waves before him. Ads by PubFuture. Then, at a very close distance on the bridge, they faced each other, Duncan being only a few steps from the sun's spot. It's here at this moment that the whole world has quieted down. I'm busy, a majestic and deep voice reached everyone's ears. Tyrion's eyes widened in amazement when he jerked to face the direction of that voice. However, this temporary rendezvous was over in mere seconds as the two phantoms sped past each other at full speed, leaving the dazed undead crew in the rear. The steel battleship eventually came to a halt little by little though as the invisible force agitating the ship subsided, and now it returned to the hands of the helmsman again. Thanks to the sailors' efforts, the severely damaged engine had shut down with an unlikely chance of it operating for a while. What just happened? Aiden scratched his bald head dazedly. That ship, just left like that. Isn't it going to fight us to the death? The bosun spoke with lingering fear. It seems that it didn't intend to fight us to the death from the very beginning. It didn't slow down much, and it just came and ran over us. It's so terrifying. For just a second there, I felt like my heart was beating again. The commotion of the crew had reached Tyrion's ears, but he was not in the mood to listen to their squabble because only two words were echoing in his head: I'm busy. It was what his father said. There were no emotions, and it was not at all a hello to a family member, borderline estranged. Yet, it was indeed a sentence that humans could understand. Clear and reasonable. Captain, First Mate Aiden came over from the side, looking at Tyrion, who had fallen silent with unease. What should we do next? Tyrion promptly woke up from his thoughts and raised his head. Can the ship still move? Ads by PubFuture. Not quite. The engine is stalled now. It will take a while to repair, and many of our men were injured in the battle just now. It's quite a serious injury, the kind that we will need to use the shovel for a whole day to clean up. Aiden shook his glowing bald head. But the most incredible thing is that those who suffered a direct hit from the Vanished were all fine. Main guns number 1 and number 3 are completely gone, but those manning it are still in good health when they fell through the hole with the ball. So you mean, the ones hit by the aftershock were seriously injured, while the men directly hit by the cannon fire came out unscathed? Tyrion surprisedly confirmed it, then frowned again. How could this be? Perhaps, your father didn't intend to kill us. Aiden glanced at his captain and said cautiously, judging from the shelling of the Vanished, it seems that it just wanted the Sea Mist to stop. November LBJNN. This, Tyrion said subconsciously but then closed his mouth at what this implied. After a few seconds of silence, he shook his head lightly. Hurry up, get the ship back up and running. At the same time, send a report to Planned, saying that we have tried our best to intercept it and failed. The Vanished is still heading towards them, the rest is up to the naval forces protecting that island. We have done our part. Aiden immediately took the order and left, but he hurried back again after a while. Captain. We can't get in touch with Plan's side. Can't get in touch. Tyrion's frown deepened. Were the signals disturbed by the battle just now? No, we can still receive signals from the Sea Patrol hub, but we can't receive plans or any signal from that island. Aiden said quickly with a puzzled expression on his face. The whole city-state seems to have disappeared from the radio. At this distance, this is simply impossible. Even the psionic call from the church side did not respond. Psionic calls didn't respond either. This time, the expression on Tyrion's face had turned grim and dreaded. The fact that the Vanished was heading straight for that city-state, plus the lack of communication, it doesn't take much for the man to connect the dots and know something has happened. When was the communication interrupted? Did anyone monitor the telegraph stations? The last call was yesterday when we had a routine briefing with the Port Authority. Everything was working properly back then, Aiden recalled, sputtering as he went. Do you want to head back instead? Speaking of this, the bald sailor paused, and his expression was a little hesitant. This is a bit beyond the original plan. Tyrion's face tensed, and he didn't speak for several seconds before finally exhaling deeply. Let's go to plan. We will leave after the sea mist is restored. Aiden was slightly surprised, but after a brief stint, the loyal first mate immediately straightened his chest and saluted. Yes, Captain. Adds by PubFuture. The turbulent sea around gradually returned to calm, and only the sound of waves could be heard in the ears. Nevertheless, Duncan still scratched his ear as the loud echoes of artillery fire lingered in his mind. He was obviously not comfortable with the sudden encounter just now. I thought you wanted to speak with Tyrion just now when you accelerated straight towards the sea mist. After all, this is a meaningful reunion. Goathead's voice rings within the captain's head. That was my initial intention, Duncan replied casually, but I changed my mind at the last second. Why? I didn't know what to say after I greeted him, Duncan said frankly. After the partial coming clean showdown with Goathead, he no longer felt threatened or in danger of being exposed by the wooden sculpture. We're not that familiar in the end. Well, you do have the final say. The Goathead has no opinion, but you'd better think about how to get along with your children in the future. Everyone is quite alive, so you must meet them sooner or later. Good family relationships are very important to one's destiny. I think there was one back then. Shut up, Duncan interrupted the other party's divergent topic. Then, as if he suddenly thought of something else, a strange and mischievous grin appeared on his face. Speaking of which, it's a pity that there are fewer people on board right now. The Goathead hesitated a little. Fewer people? You mean? Alice isn't here. She's helping to watch the shop over in the city side, Duncan said in a leisurely and even cheerful tone. I just suddenly remembered that Tyrion had been working under the Frost Queen back then, and Alice is wearing the face of the Frost Queen. Imagine her being aboard the ship when Tyrion passed us. I wonder what sort of ideas he would have in the coming days. Goathead, why are you so quiet? Aren't you usually very talkative? I don't have a good comment regarding your family affairs, Goathead replied, but after listening to what you said, I think that scene would be worth looking forward to. If not, why don't we make a round trip? This time with Miss Alice aboard. Of course, Duncan ignored this whimsical offer. I didn't know you were such a humorous person. What is a humorous person? Duncan didn't answer the other party again, only raising his head and staring off into a certain direction. Just now, he clearly sensed his other body in planned and even the flames spreading everywhere on the other side of the curtain. As he had expected, after getting close enough, the connection between the two sides are strengthening. Chapter 209 Inches Reality Invasion. The rainstorm did not stop, and there were even signs of intensification while the frenzied wind and rain battered the towering walls of the storm church. Spiderwalkers and steam tanks had already assembled in the main square, their heavily armed drivers silently blocking off the city intersections for any suspicious targets. Meanwhile, on the bell tower at the back of the cathedral, a special brazier was lit with a special mix of purified whale fat and sea wood. The flame acted as a beacon for the ship's coming home, and even from afar, its visibility was unmatched in its grandness. Taking this as a signal, the more remote chapels across the city had also lit similar flames in their own towers, effectively creating a grand spell circle to protect the entire island. Everything was moving and coming along. The boilers of the church turned on, the bells ringing, the protectors on full alert, and the inhabitants taking shelter. However, this brief facade of safety wasn't enough to blind the transcendent tonight, for even the most mundane had detected the unsettling creepiness lurking within this storm. NOVELBJN.C. Deep in the admin's mansion, Dante Wayne, who had just awakened from his coma, immediately turned towards the window when he heard the bells and whistles outside. He could see the lighthouses lighting up from afar. After getting up with the help of his attendant, he promptly asked, "The main cathedral activated the reality stabilizer, a disaster of reality invasion level occurred. We are still investigating the situation." An assistant came to Dante's bed and answered, his tone slightly nervous and worried. The situation happened very suddenly, so the main cathedral had no choice but to take action by blocking off the various sectors without your permission. Bishop Valentine used his emergency authority since you were in a coma. Dante did not respond to the aide's words as if he was preoccupied with something else. Vanna is back. Miss Vanna. After hearing this, the aide caring for him turned his head in confusion. Miss Vanna has not returned to the mansion yet. She should. I know. Dante knew the others wouldn't understand his words and waved the subject off. Are the city forces still under the command of City Hall? Yes. Bishop Valentine has only taken over the police forces and a small number of the city army responsible for emergency response. The aide nodded immediately. Most of the city-state soldiers are still waiting for your orders. Ads by PubFuture. Okay, except for the 1st Division, have all other divisions follow the church's arrangement. Dante felt the grogginess in his mind coming back and quickened his words. In addition, the entire city is to enter the highest level of martial law. Activate all the alarms, and if anyone appears on the streets, it doesn't matter who, treat them as heretics. The aide was immediately taken aback by this order. Mr. Dante, this. Carry out the order. Dante fixed his gaze on the aide with that blood-oozing ruby eye. We're in a state of war. Yes, sir. The aide promptly left following that order, leaving Dante to cough violently in the back until it eventually subsided. Then turning to the second aide in the room, take me to the cathedral. Mr. Dante, your body. My body doesn't matter. I have something important to tell Bishop Valentine. Yes, sir. Nina tightly grasped Shirley's hand as they sat behind the window and watched the fierce weather outside. The continuous rumble from the thunderstrikes had left the girl uneasy and scared. I4X, what the hell is up with this 4X weather? Shirley complained after finally losing her patience. Shirley, you can't swear. Nina was also scared but still straightened her face and lectured her friend. Uncle said you. Okay, I won't swear. I swear I won't curse anymore. Please don't tell Mr. Duncan, Shirley said quickly. Then out of the corner of her eyes, she noticed the figure that had appeared on the stairs. Ah, Mr. Duncan is coming down. Ads by PubFuture. Uncle Duncan. Nina stood up abruptly and almost ran to her uncle. Are you done? It's over for now, but it's not completely over yet, Duncan said, casually ruffling Nina's hair before turning to Morris behind the counter. Then he gave the old scholar an affirming nod. She is back now. I know, I just felt it too, Morris said immediately. I don't know how you did it, but, thank you very much for your help. This is just the beginning, it's too early to thank me, Duncan said while turning his head to look out the window. The conspiracy has been revealed, and they have started to take action ahead of their schedule. The invaders are attacking the other side of the curtain as we speak. I estimate it won't be long before they also come to this side. Morris looked worried, while Nina appeared confused. Uncle, what invader? What you said. Nina, Duncan interrupted the girl directly and got all serious. Do you believe me? Nina barely hesitated. I believe. Very good. Then you must firmly believe that this storm will end safely. No matter what happens, don't panic, and no matter what I do, don't be nervous or afraid. Duncan stared into Nina's eyes so his words would get through. Then glancing over to the doll at the counter, Alice can be trusted. If there is a real emergency, you stay with her. Nina nodded dully as Alice chimed in with her own piece. Don't worry, Mr. Duncan, I will protect Miss Nina. Honestly, I'm really not assured by your combat power. Duncan frowned and sighed helplessly, but there is no one else to entrust. Another burst of thunder caused another flicker through the window again, then came the deafening sound of a collapsing building in the distance, followed by the sharp ringing of bells across the entire city. Then abruptly, the lights in the antique shop flickered a few times until they finally snuffed themselves out. The power had been cut, and darkness instantly enveloped the entire neighborhood like night had fallen. Shirley's timid voice sounded in the dimness. I'll light the oil lamp. I know where the oil lamp is. Ads by PubFuture. Duncan didn't object and grabbed Nina's hand after noticing the increased heat next to himself. Uncle, Nina whispered nervously and urgently, and soon, even the airflow around the girl had turned hot. I think, it's a little hot. Duncan's gaze became grim and ugly in the darkness like he wanted to murder someone. However, the man did not panic and kept a cool head since he was prepared for something like this. He gently held Nina's increasingly hot hand, and between his palm and Nina's fingers, a little green flame had flickered into life in the imperceptible crevices. I flew down the stairs with her wings flapping as if on cue and firmly landed on the counter. She had gotten the message through the mental connection and came as summoned. Likewise, Shirley had also returned with the lit oil lamp, dispelling the darkness in the shop with that shaky flame from the candle. However, the outside was a different story. It's grown much darker than before, borderline grimy black, and impossible to see beyond the initial few feet. Nina, remember what I told you just now? Duncan's voice pierced the darkness and into Nina's ears. Nina nodded slightly. Don't be afraid, something will happen in a bit, something very amazing, Duncan smiled and said softly. The man had started to look off into the distance, past the window, past the stormy streets, and past the projection taking place over the island. Instead, his gaze had crossed the waters to where the vanished shape was coming into view. Heidi subconsciously shrunk her neck the moment the last thunder sounded. She's currently nestled on the bench in the cathedral's main hall, subconsciously grasping the crystal bracelet with both hands and silently chanting the holy name of Lahem, the god of wisdom. The goddess shouldn't mind, right? She muttered softly after pausing, then continued to chant the name of Lahem. But suddenly, she stopped again, and a strange thumping in her heart made it difficult for the lady to concentrate. Getting up from the bench, Heidi looked around for the source of this sensation. Nothing unusual about the place. A bunch of guards at the main entrance, a group of civilians taking shelter in the church due to being late from work, and several priests walking around the hall for comfort. Yes, aside from the burning trinket she got from her father, there's nothing wrong with this situation. Everything's definitely fine, that was until she glanced at the stained glass. Fire, she exclaimed with horror, it's raining fire. Chapter 210 Inches Rain of Fire. This seemingly illogical and confused cry was the only description Heidi could think of at the moment. She couldn't understand what she was seeing or what was happening. All she knew was that flames were literally raining down from the sky. Everything happened without warning. 1 second it's still raining water, the next the water had turned into droplets of fire, immersing the entire city in a hellscape of red. It didn't matter if it was the trees, houses, towers, or churches. Everything had turned red. Worst of all, deafening explosions are blowing up across various points on the island. The whole place had turned into a war zone, shaking like it's being pummeled by artillery shells. It's a true apocalypse that has draped over reality. Heidi nearly crumbled to the ground at the horrific sight. Thankfully, the sound of the church bells had begun to ring non-stop then, bringing some semblance of sanity back to those fortunate enough to hear it. That's the reality barrier at work. Through the powers of the goddess brought forward by this melodious chime, the pouring flames couldn't penetrate the church's protection when they touched the cathedral. Unfortunately, it also meant the various chapels are now effectively isolated islands within this hellscape, each becoming its own anchor point for the Grand Barrier. The enemy has attacked. Destroy all the targets that try to get close to the bell tower. Bishop Valentine broke the frightening silence and returned the doctor to her senses. Heidi swung her head and was about to ask something when another explosive bang interrupted her vocals. It came from the square, and the noise was not friendly at all. She ran to the window and peered out, seeing what she feared the most. The assembled defenders were desperately firing their guns off at the enemy, with the spiderwalkers and tanks unleashing the full might of Plan's army. The enemies came in the form of wriggling humanoid ashes. They were truly an endless horde, crawling and squirming out from under the barrage of bullets and shells. Heidi reflexively shuddered. She could see the agonizing roars and screams from those things. They may take a humanoid form, but make no mistake, the doctor knows full well they're nothing more than mindless beasts at this point. Furthermore, there's only one reason they're attacking the cathedral: to destroy the stabilizing eye within the bell tower in the back. Once that falls, the other spell matrices in the smaller chapels would also fail, effectively destroying Plan in one blow. Ads by PubFuture. The warriors all knew this, the citizens knew this, and the clerics knew this more than everyone. They did not hesitate to fight the enemy with everything they had in this battle: bullets, bolts of holy light, and any weapon the abled citizen could find. They threw everything at these monsters, including their own body as a human wall. This world was a cruel one. From childhood to adulthood, the system has ingrained into its people that if you want to live, you must fight for it. Nothing in this world came without a cost. Here was the price. If they want to live, they cannot fall lest the entire reality comes falling down over their heads and be replaced by this burning hell. So, with guns blazing and swords slashing, the warriors of mortal kind brought their full might upon the darkness. It didn't matter to them if the swarming horde was endless. They would fight, even if it meant dying today. No one gives up in this world. Hold the bell tower. Valentine's roared with mighty authority that echoed across the entire city-state. As long as the spell I remains ringing, they cannot twist our reality. Faithful ones, the time has come to show your strength. Fight, hold the line at all costs. Heidi watched the huge chaos that ensued from numerous points outside the main cathedral. Most of the forces had already gathered here, but many survivors still managed to escape the initial wave from the monsters. It didn't matter if they had no training or fighting experience, if the person could swing a club or metal rod, they came and fought. Is there anything I can help with? After seeing how desperate everyone was fighting, the doc quickly approached the head bishop and asked. Go reassure the young and elderly inside. We need to avoid a breakdown in order within the main cathedral, Valentine said in a deep voice, and then wait with them for the storm to end. As Heidi immediately nodded at the order, Valentine instead raised his head and peered upwards at the sky like he was staring off into the distance. Sure enough, the entire city's situation was now reflected in his eyes from a bird's eye view. Everything had ignited into flames with countless dead strewn across the streets. Through his eyes, he could also see the chapels across the entire city, each sheltering as many helpless citizens that managed to escape in time before the initial slaughter. They're also feverishly fighting to fend off the evil that has descended upon them, but likewise, the enemy is also as feverish in their attacks. It would just be a matter of time before those anchor points fall if nothing was done. Eventually, Valentine's sight locked onto a set of dark shadows hiding in the rear of the biggest horde attacking the main cathedral. These were no normal heretics, that much he was certain. Ads by PubFuture. The minions of the Sun Heirs. NOVELBJN.C Ohm. Valentine's expression changed for the worst. In the face of this devastating disaster, he suddenly remembered a small matter that had supposedly been resolved long ago and was almost forgotten. He jerked and swung his head to a high-ranking priest next to himself. Are those Suntists still in the underground sanctuary? Suntists. The high-level priest didn't catch on and took a second to react. Ah, yes, they are still detained in the underground sanctuary. There is a whole brigade of guardians watching them. They can't escape. They never wanted to escape from the start. Valentine said quickly. They wanted to be locked up in the church from the very start. What? The high-ranking priest's eyes widened instantly, and then, before his words could finish, a dull loud bang suddenly rocked the entire cathedral. It was like some giant beast had awakened in the underground sanctuary. Like Valentine, several priests in the cathedral who had experienced the Suntist crisis 4 years ago had also connected the dots through this noise. Back then, hundreds of Suntists had gathered in their foul den and summoned a brief and terrifying force through a massive blood ritual. It's a fake sun that nearly brought catastrophe to the city. But before they could succeed, their plot was discovered by Vanna, who had just become the new Inquisitor, and vanquished their plot. It was a test, the high-ranking priest muttered to himself with great shock. Ads by PubFuture. A sea of fire rose, bells chimed, sirens whistled, and countless ash monsters emerged from all directions, rampaging across the earthly world. Vanna has experienced many dangerous and sinister battles in her times. She had faced cultists, taboo monsters created by their foul deeds, and even out-of-control ghostly demons and crazy enders, but no battle could compare to this purgatory at this moment. She was no longer facing a battlefield but a sudden apocalypse. In other words, the end has already come, an end that has been postponed by the curtain until today. But she was still alive, carving a bloody path through the sea of fire. It's a hard struggle, but it won't be long before she arrives at the main cathedral. Every breath brought a burning pain, and her physical exhaustion was almost to the point where an ordinary person would be crushed several times. Worst of all, the armor on Vanna's body had also been severely damaged, and her body's recovery could no longer keep up with the speed of the damage, leaving her injuries to get worse little by little. But the young Inquisitor still kept moving forward. The cathedral's bells are still ringing, indicating that Bishop Valentine's defenses have not yet been breached. Perhaps the defenders are unaware of this plot to pollute history, but they are always prepared for all intrigues and battles. Since the battle for the cathedral continues, she has no right to give up. Furthermore, the lady wasn't just mindlessly hacking and slashing at everything that moved. She noticed that Bishop Valentine had initiated reality stabilization measures, showing that he also sensed part of the truth. So at least this part of the response was fine, and as long as the bell tower did not fail, the heretical plot to overshadow the true history with a pseudo-history would not succeed. They need to interrupt the coverage and strip the source of this pollution. Only by doing so would the destruction be halted and the city saved. All in all, it's not too late to do something. As if cheering herself up, Vanna tried not to think about the possibility of the church branches being lost or the mysterious and terrible Captain Duncan lurking in wait for herself. In her mind, she only wanted to destroy the obstacles blocking her path, which she did so by mechanically stepping forward and slashing down the monster that got in her way. But suddenly, she stopped at an intersection not far from the cathedral. A dark gray car had tipped over on the side of the road. Several bodies were thrown out of the vehicle, but only one had caught her attention, the one still inside the vehicle. Vanna instantly recognized the car and the bloodied arm that's showing through the cracked window. It was her uncle, Dante Wayne.